Eleanor Ashby was pulled out of bed before sunrise and told she would be married by noon. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood in the middle of her small room, still in her nightclothes, staring at her father as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. George Ashby could not look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor, on the window, on anything that was not his daughter's face. "Married to whom?" Eleanor finally asked. "The Duke of Ravensmore." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor had heard of Julian Hartley, Duke of Ravensmore, the way everyone in London had heard of him. He was young, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly uninterested in taking a wife. There were whispers about him in every drawing room and every card game, whispers that grew louder each year he remained unmarried. Some said he preferred the company of men. Others said he preferred no company at all. Whatever the truth, no mother in London would risk her daughter's reputation by pushing her toward him, because a marriage that existed only in name would ruin a young woman's chances forever, which was exactly why he had agreed to marry Eleanor. Her father's shipping business had collapsed 3 months earlier, swallowed whole by bad debts and worse decisions at the gaming tables. The Ashby name, once respected among merchants, was now spoken with pity or contempt. Without a dowry, without connections, Eleanor had nothing to offer a husband. But the Duke did not need money. He needed a wife who would ask no questions and expect no affection, a wife whose family was desperate enough to accept humiliation instead of scandal. "He will not touch you," her father said, as though this were meant to comfort her. "You will have his name, his protection, his money. That is all. It is more than we could have hoped for." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say. In a matter of hours, she would belong to a stranger who did not want her. In a marriage the whole of London already considered a joke. She thought of the life she had imagined for herself only a year before, back when her father's business still brought in enough money for new dresses and quiet evenings with friends. She had imagined a modest match, a man who might grow fond of her over time, children who filled a house with noise instead of silence. None of that mattered now. Debt had a way of erasing every plan a person made for their own future, replacing it instead with someone else's terms. Her Aunt Margaret arrived within the hour to help her dress, since there was no lady's maid willing to spare the time for a family already whispered about across the city. Margaret's hands shook as she fastened the buttons down Eleanor's back, and twice she paused as though she meant to say something comforting, only to close her mouth again and continue her work in silence. There was nothing comforting to say, and both women knew it. "You must hold your head high," Margaret finally managed, tying the last ribbon. "Whatever they say about him, whatever they say about this marriage, you will be a duchess by evening. Let them whisper. A title outlasts gossip." Eleanor almost laughed at that, though there was no humor in it. A title would not warm an empty bed. A title would not give her a husband who wanted her company. But she nodded anyway, because her aunt needed her to nod, and because there was no version of this day that ended with Eleanor refusing to walk through the chapel doors. The wedding took place in a small chapel outside the city, away from curious eyes. Eleanor wore a borrowed gown that did not fit properly at the shoulders. Her mother had died years before, and there was no one to fix the hem, no one to arrange her hair, no one to tell her she looked beautiful, even if it was a lie. She stood alone at the altar until the doors opened and the Duke walked in. He was not what she expected. She had pictured someone soft, someone who moved through the world without weight or purpose, since that was the picture society had painted of him. Instead, she saw a tall man with dark hair and a controlled, careful way of walking, as though every step had been measured before he took it. His face gave away nothing. He did not smile at her. He did not frown either. He simply nodded once, the way a man might acknowledge a business partner, and took his place beside her. The ceremony was short. The vows were spoken quickly, without warmth. When the priest instructed him to take her hand, Julian did so with a grip that was firm but distant, as though he were shaking hands after signing a contract rather than marrying a woman for life. Eleanor felt the coldness of it settle into her chest. She had known this marriage would be hollow. She had not expected it to feel quite so much like a transaction conducted in a chapel instead of a counting house. When it was over, there was no celebration. No wedding breakfast, no toasts, no friends gathered to wish them well. Julian offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, and together they walked to a waiting carriage that would take her away from the only home she had ever known. Inside the carriage, silence stretched between them like a wall. Eleanor watched the city pass by the window, the gray rooftops and the smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys, and tried to steady her breathing. She was a bride, with a husband who had not spoken a single word to her beyond his vows. She did not know if she was meant to speak first, or wait, or say nothing at all. Finally, she broke the silence herself. "You do not have to pretend with me," she said quietly. "I know why this marriage happened. I know what people say about you. I will not embarrass you by expecting anything you cannot give." For the first time, Julian turned his head and looked at her directly. His eyes were a deep gray, sharp and searching, and for a brief moment something flickered behind them that Eleanor could not name. It was there and gone before she could study it further. "You know nothing," he said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that closed the subject entirely. She waited for him to explain. He did not. He turned back to the window, and the silence returned, heavier than before. They traveled for hours before the carriage finally slowed, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Ravensmoor. The estate rose out of the countryside like something built to be seen from a distance and admired, not approached. Stone towers, dark windows, gardens that stretched farther than she could see in the fading light. It was beautiful in the way a locked door is beautiful, promising something behind it that no one was permitted to reach. Servants lined the entrance to greet them, their faces polite and unreadable, trained not to show curiosity even toward a bride no one had expected the Duke to take. Eleanor searched their expressions for any sign of warmth and found only careful, practiced neutrality. She understood then that she would find no allies here, only people paid to watch and say nothing. A woman stepped forward, older, dressed in dark gray, her hands folded in front of her. She introduced herself as Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, and offered to show Eleanor to her rooms. Julian said nothing to stop this. He simply turned and walked in the opposite direction, disappearing down a corridor without a backward glance, leaving his new wife to be led away by a servant on the very first night of their marriage. Eleanor caught the eye of one younger maid among the row of servants, a girl no older than herself with red hair pinned tightly beneath her cap. For half a second, something like sympathy passed across the girl's face before she remembered herself and looked away, staring instead at a fixed point on the gravel drive. That flicker of feeling, however brief, was the first honest thing Eleanor had seen since arriving, and she held on to it as she climbed the front steps of her new home. The entrance hall alone was larger than her father's entire house had ever been. Marble floors stretched beneath a ceiling painted with clouds and gilded trim, and a staircase curved upward on either side like open arms that did not quite reach far enough to embrace anyone who entered. Eleanor's footsteps echoed too loudly against the stone, announcing her presence in a space that seemed built to remind visitors how small they truly were. Eleanor followed Mrs. Whitmore up a wide staircase, and down a long hallway lined with portraits of Hartley ancestors, stern faces staring down at her, as though judging whether she belonged among them. Her rooms, when she reached them, were grand but cold, decorated in colors that suggested no one had chosen them with any particular person in mind. A fire had been lit, but it did little to warm the space. "Will His Grace be joining me?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. Mrs. Whitmore's expression did not change. "His Grace keeps to his own chambers, my lady. He always has." There it was, confirmed plainly, without cruelty, but without comfort either. Eleanor thanked her, and was left alone. She sat by the window long after the servants had gone, looking out at the dark shape of the gardens below, and allowed herself, finally, one quiet moment of grief. Not for the marriage she had wanted, because she had never truly believed she would have a choice in who she married. She grieved instead for the loneliness stretching out in front of her, years of it, a husband's name without a husband's presence, a house full of people who would never be her friends. She thought of her father's words, that this was more than they could have hoped for. Perhaps he was right. She had a roof over her head and food she would never have to worry about again. But as she pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window, she wondered if safety without warmth was truly a mercy, or simply a different kind of ruin. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Footsteps moved along a distant corridor and stopped. Eleanor turned toward her own door, half expecting, half hoping that it might open. It did not. She did not yet know that Julian stood on the other side of that same wall for a long moment before walking away, his hand resting briefly against the wood as though he meant to knock and then thought better of it. She did not know that the coldness in his eyes during their wedding was not indifference toward her at all, but the careful mask of a man protecting something he could not yet explain, not to a stranger, not even to a wife. All she knew, as she finally climbed into an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, was that she had married a man the world called untouchable, and that whatever waited for her at Ravensmoor, it was only beginning. Eleanor woke to the sound of rain against the window and, for a moment, forgot where she was. Then the unfamiliar ceiling, the cold sheets on the empty side of the bed, and the weight of the day before all returned at once. She dressed without help, since no lady's maid had been assigned to her yet, and made her way downstairs, following the smell of fresh bread toward what she hoped was a breakfast room. She found it after 2 wrong turns, a bright space with tall windows overlooking the gardens, and to her surprise, Julian was already seated at the table, a cup of tea in front of him, and a newspaper folded beside his plate. He rose slightly when she entered, a small gesture of manners rather than warmth, and gestured for her to sit. "I trust you slept well," he said, though his eyes stayed on the paper rather than on her. "Well enough," Eleanor answered, taking her seat. She studied him openly, since he was not looking at her to notice. In the morning light, he looked less like the untouchable figure from the wedding, and more like a man who had not slept much himself. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and his hand, when he lifted his cup, was not quite steady. "You do not have to sit with me out of duty," he said, finally glancing up. "I know this marriage was not your choice, nor yours, I imagine," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression, quick and guarded, gone before she could name it. "No," he agreed, "not entirely." She wanted to press further, to ask what he meant by not entirely, but a servant entered with fresh tea, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. Julian returned his attention to the newspaper, and Eleanor ate in silence, aware of how carefully he had chosen his words, as though every sentence had been weighed before it left his mouth. Over the following days, Eleanor began to learn the shape of her new life. Ravensmoor ran with the precision of a household that had been managed the same way for years. Every servant assigned a role, every hour of the day accounted for. She was given a lady's maid at last, a quiet young woman named Betsy who answered questions carefully and volunteered nothing beyond what was asked. Eleanor quickly understood that discretion was not simply encouraged at Ravensmoor, it was required. She saw Julian rarely, and always in passing. He took his meals at odd hours, disappeared for long stretches into his study, and rode out early most mornings before she had even woken. When their paths did cross, he was polite, even considerate in small ways, ensuring she had everything she needed, asking after her comfort. But he kept a careful distance, as though an invisible line had been drawn between them that he was determined never to cross. Eleanor spent much of her free time exploring the grounds, partly out of curiosity, and partly to fill the long hours she otherwise had no way to occupy. She walked the gardens each afternoon, learning the paths between the hedges, discovering a small stone folly hidden behind a wall of climbing roses, a place that felt untouched by the rest of the estate's careful formality. She began to think of it as her own, a quiet corner where no one watched her, and no one required anything of her. Betsy proved a steady, if guarded, companion during these early days. She answered practical questions readily enough: which staircase led where, which rooms were kept locked and why, what hours the cook expected meals to be requested. But whenever Eleanor asked anything about Julian himself, about his moods or his habits before her arrival, Betsy's answers grew short and careful, as though she had been trained to say only what was safe. "Has he always kept to himself this way?" Eleanor asked one morning, while Betsy arranged her hair. "His Grace has always valued his privacy, my lady," Betsy said, eyes fixed on her work. "Longer than I have been in service here, I believe." "And before that, was he different?" Betsy's hands paused for the briefest moment. "I could not say, my lady. I only know the house as it is now." It was not quite a lie, Eleanor suspected, but it was not the whole truth either. Everyone in this house seemed to speak in careful half-sentences, offering just enough to satisfy politeness without ever revealing anything real. She began to understand that whatever secret shaped this household, it was old enough and serious enough that even the servants had learned to guard it without being told twice. It was on the 4th day that Eleanor first noticed something odd. She had gone looking for a book in the estate's library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and found the door to Julian's adjoining study slightly open. She had not meant to look inside, but as she passed, she saw him standing at his desk, not reading or writing, but staring at a folded letter in his hand, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight. He did not notice her. For a long moment, she watched a man who looked nothing like the composed, distant duke she had married. He looked, instead, like someone bracing for bad news that had not yet arrived. She stepped back quietly and continued down the hall, unsettled by what she had seen. Later that afternoon, she mentioned it carefully to no one, turning the memory over in her mind instead as she sat in the small stone folly with a book she did not truly read. A man who kept the world at arm's length did not usually look so afraid of a single letter, unless the letter carried more weight than paper should ever hold. She thought too of the way the household staff moved through their duties with a kind of watchfulness she had not seen in her father's home, glancing toward doors before speaking, lowering their voices when certain names were mentioned. It was the behavior of people who had learned, through hard experience, that carelessness in this house carried consequences. Eleanor did not yet know what those consequences were, but she recognized the pattern of fear when she saw it, even dressed up in the polished manners of a great estate. That evening at dinner, they were joined by a guest Eleanor had not expected. A man near Julian's age, sharing something of his coloring and build, was announced as Edmund Hartley, the Duke's cousin. He greeted Eleanor with practiced charm, kissing her hand and complimenting her gown, but there was something calculating behind his smile that made her instinctively wary. "So this is the bride," Edmund said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man who considered himself at home wherever he sat. "London has spoken of little else for weeks. I must say, Julian, you have surprised us all." "I imagine you have better things to discuss than gossip," Julian replied, his voice even, though Eleanor caught the tightness beneath it. "On the contrary, cousin. Gossip is the only entertainment London offers this season." Edmund turned his attention to Eleanor. "Tell me, my lady, how are you finding married life? I understand it comes with certain unusual arrangements." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her voice steady. "I find Ravensmoor a fine home, sir. I have no complaints." "How diplomatic." Edmund smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Julian, you have chosen well. A wife who knows when to hold her tongue is a rare thing." The comment was delivered lightly, but it landed like an insult wrapped in a compliment. Eleanor glanced at Julian and saw his hand tighten briefly around his glass before he set it down with deliberate calm. "You must forgive my cousin," Edmund went on, turning back to Eleanor as though delivering a kindness. "He has never been comfortable with company. I sometimes wonder if he would have been happier born a monk than a duke. All those years abroad, shut away from society. It does strange things to a man's temperament." "Years abroad?" Eleanor repeated, unable to help herself. "Did he not tell you?" Edmund's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise, though Eleanor sensed the surprise was entirely performed. 3 years on the continent, before his father passed, came back a different man, or so everyone says. I was rather young myself, but even I noticed the change. "Edmund," Julian said, his voice low, "I do not believe my wife requires a history lesson at dinner." "Merely making conversation, cousin. No need to take offense." Edmund lifted his glass in a small, mocking toast and let the subject drop, though the words had already done their work. Eleanor turned the information over carefully, filing it away alongside the folded letter she had seen in Julian's hand, the tension that never quite left his shoulders, the careful, guarded way every servant in this house spoke about their master. Whatever had happened during those 3 years abroad, she was now certain it lay near the center of whatever secret Julian was so determined to protect. "Edmund," he said, "perhaps you might tell us how your own affairs are progressing. I understand your allowance has needed adjusting again." The charm on Edmund's face flickered, just slightly, before returning fully intact. "A temporary matter, nothing that concerns you." "Everything concerning this family concerns me," Julian said quietly, and for the first time, Eleanor heard something underneath his careful composure. Not quite anger. Something closer to warning. Edmund laughed it off and changed the subject, steering the conversation toward safer topics, but the tension at the table did not fully dissolve. Eleanor found herself watching the two men as though observing a chess match where she could see the pieces moving, but not yet understand the rules. After Edmund departed later that evening, Eleanor found Julian alone on the terrace, staring out at the darkened gardens. She hesitated before approaching, unsure whether he would welcome the company. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders had not fully relaxed even now that his cousin was gone, made her stay. "He unsettles you," she said, coming to stand beside him. Julian did not look at her immediately. "He unsettles everyone. It is one of his more useful talents." "Is he truly your heir?" "Presumptive heir," Julian corrected. "As things currently stand." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You should know, Eleanor, that not everyone in this family wishes me well. It would be safer for you to keep your distance from Edmund, and to be careful what you say around anyone in this house you do not fully trust." It was the first time he had used her name, and the first time he had offered her anything resembling honesty since their wedding. Eleanor turned to study his profile in the dim light. "You speak as though there is real danger here," she said, "not simply family rivalry." Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. "There are things about this house, and about me, that I am not yet ready to explain," he finally said, I ask only that you trust I have reasons for the distance I keep. It has nothing to do with you, or any failing on your part. And if I told you I do not frighten easily?" For the first time since she had arrived at Ravensmoor, something close to a real smile touched his mouth, brief and reluctant, as though he had not expected to feel it. "Then perhaps," he said, "you are a more interesting duchess than London gave you credit for." It was not much. A few sentences on a dark terrace, a smile that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. But it was more warmth than Eleanor had received since stepping into the carriage on her wedding day, and she found herself, against every instinct toward caution, wanting more of it. She did not yet know how dangerous that wanting would prove to be, nor how carefully Julian was choosing every word to keep her from the truth he could not yet risk telling her. But standing there in the cool night air, watching the tension slowly leave his shoulders, she understood one thing clearly. Whatever waited beneath the surface of this marriage, it was far more complicated and far more perilous than a husband who simply did not want a wife. The knock on Eleanor's door came well past midnight, when she had already given up on sleep, and sat instead by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a shawl, watching the last of the embers die. She was not entirely surprised to find Julian standing there when she opened it. Something in his face that evening at dinner had told her a conversation was coming, one neither of them could postpone much longer. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. She stepped aside, and he entered, closing the door softly behind him. For a long moment, he simply stood near the fireplace, staring at the dying coals as though searching for the right place to begin. Eleanor waited, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders, saying nothing, giving him the silence he seemed to need. "I owe you an explanation," he finally said, "longer overdue than I am proud to admit." "You do not owe me anything," Eleanor said. "We both know why this marriage happened." "That is not entirely true." He turned to face her fully now, and in the low firelight, she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The exhaustion of a man who had been guarding something for far too long without rest. "I did not marry you only to save your family from ruin, though that was part of it. I married you because I needed a wife whose presence would not draw suspicion, and because your circumstances meant you would have every reason to accept a marriage that asks no questions." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Suspicion of what? Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower still, as though even these walls might be listening. 3 years ago, while I was traveling abroad, someone made an attempt on my life. Poison, slipped into wine, at a dinner meant for close family only. I survived, barely, and I have spent every year since trying to determine who was responsible, without letting that person know I suspect them at all. The words settled over Eleanor slowly, reshaping everything she had seen since arriving at Ravensmoor, the tension in the servants, the careful, guarded way Julian spoke about his own household, the letter that had left him so shaken in his study. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. "That night, 3 years ago." Julian's gaze drifted toward the window, though Eleanor doubted he was truly seeing the darkened gardens beyond it. "It was a small dinner, family only, at a villa outside Florence. My father had passed only months before, and I had inherited the title far younger than anyone expected. There were toasts, as there always are at such gatherings. I remember the wine tasting slightly bitter, and dismissing it as nothing more than a poor vintage. Within an hour, I could no longer stand without assistance. My physician later told me that had I finished the glass instead of setting it aside half full, I would not have survived the night. Who was present? Edmund, among others, my father's solicitor. A handful of distant relations who rarely traveled together otherwise, which I found strange even then, though I said nothing at the time. I spent the following weeks recovering under the excuse of a lingering fever, and used that time to watch everyone's reactions carefully. Edmund's concern seemed genuine enough on the surface, but he was also the only person present who benefited directly from my death, and the only one who pressed, again and again, for details about my recovery that seemed less like concern and more like confirmation. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, picturing a young man newly burdened with a title, nearly killed at his own family table, forced from that moment forward to treat every relative, every servant, every offered glass of wine as a potential threat. It explained a great deal about the careful, guarded man who had walked into the chapel beside her, offering nothing of himself to anyone. "You have lived 3 years like this," she said, "trusting no one." "I trusted no one," he agreed, "until tonight." "Edmund," she said quietly. "I believe so. I cannot prove it, not yet." Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so unlike his usual careful composure that it startled her more than his words had. He has motive. If I die without an heir, the title and everything attached to it passes to him. He has spent years cultivating exactly the reputation of a harmless, charming cousin, while quietly positioning himself closer to power than anyone realizes. And the rumors about you, Eleanor said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, that you have no interest in marriage, in women at all. You let people believe that. I encouraged it, Julian admitted. A duke with no interest in wives is a duke unlikely to produce an heir. It made me less of a threat to Edmund's ambitions, and it kept anyone I might have genuinely cared for at a safe distance from a man someone wanted dead. I could not risk loving someone and watching that love become a weapon used against me, or worse, against them. Then why marry at all? Pressure from my father's oldest friends, men who sit on the family trust and control funds I cannot access without a wife to prove my household is, as they put it, properly settled. I needed a marriage that satisfied their conditions without creating a target, someone with no standing in society to lose, no family influential enough to ask dangerous questions, and desperate enough to accept a husband who could offer no real affection in return. He paused, his jaw tightening. I am aware of how that sounds. I am not proud of the calculation, but I believed, and still believe, that it was the safest path for both of us. Eleanor sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, absorbing the shape of the marriage she had entered without ever understanding its true terms. She had believed herself a convenient solution to a scandal, a woman married for her lack of value in the eyes of society. Instead, she had been chosen as a shield, a careful piece placed on a board in a game she had not known was being played. You could have told me, she said, before the wedding. I deserved to know what I was walking into. Would you have agreed, knowing the truth? I do not know, Eleanor admitted honestly, but it should have been my choice to make. Julian's expression shifted, something like genuine regret passing across it. You are right. I told myself that protecting you meant keeping you ignorant, that what you did not know could not endanger you. I see now that reasoning was as much for my own comfort as for your safety. It is easier to justify secrecy than to risk someone walking away once they know the truth. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, this man who had built himself into a rumor, who had let the world believe a lie about his own heart in order to survive whatever waited for him in the shadows of his own family. She thought of the flicker of warmth on the terrace 2 nights before, the careful way he had chosen his words even then, protecting her without fully trusting her. What happens now? She asked. Now that I know, now you understand why distance was never about you, Julian said. And you understand the danger that comes with this house, this name, and this marriage. If you wish, I will arrange for you to live quietly at one of the smaller properties, away from Ravensmoor, away from Edmund's reach. You would still have my name and my protection, without the risk of being caught in whatever comes next. Eleanor considered this offer carefully. It would have been the easy path, the safe path, the one her father would have chosen for her without hesitation. A quiet house somewhere far away, comfort without danger, a marriage that remained a marriage in name only, exactly as she had expected from the beginning. But something in her resisted the idea entirely. No, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I did not come to this marriage by choice, but I am here now, and I will not spend the rest of my life hiding in some quiet house while you face this alone. If Edmund is truly a danger to you, then he is a danger to whatever household bears your name, wherever I happen to be living. I would rather stand where I can see the threat than wait somewhere safe for news of what happened to my husband. Julian stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You do not know what you are offering. This is not a small danger, Eleanor. A man already willing to poison his own family will not hesitate twice. Then we will be careful together, she said. You have spent 3 years protecting this secret alone, watching everyone, trusting no one. Perhaps it is time you allowed someone to help carry that weight, instead of carrying it by yourself. For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, casting the room in deep shadow, and in that dim light, Eleanor watched something shift in his posture, some old, exhausted tension easing just slightly, as though her words had lifted a portion of a weight he had carried for far too long without help. I did not expect this from you, he finally said quietly. I expected a wife who would keep her distance, as I intended to keep mine. I did not expect someone willing to stand beside me once she understood the cost of doing so. Perhaps London misjudged both of us, Eleanor said. You, for what they assumed about your heart, and me, for what they assumed I was worth. Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile touched his mouth, brief but genuine. unlike the careful, practiced expressions he offered at dinner or in company. "Then we begin again," he said, "not as strangers bound by convenience, but as partners who understand exactly what we are facing." He extended his hand, not the distant, formal grip from their wedding day, but something steadier, an offer rather than a formality. Eleanor took it, and for the first time since stepping into the carriage that had carried her away from her old life, she felt something other than dread settle into her chest. Fear, certainly, given everything he had told her. But alongside it, something that felt almost like purpose. The sense that she had been handed not a hollow marriage, but a genuine role to play, one she intended to take seriously. "There is one more thing you should know," Julian said, his voice growing more serious again. "Edmund does not act alone. Someone within this household has been reporting to him, feeding him information about my movements, my correspondence, even my finances. I have suspected it for months, but have not yet identified who." Eleanor thought immediately of the careful, guarded way every servant spoke, the watchfulness she had noticed since her first day at Ravensmoor. "The household already behaves like people afraid of being overheard," she said. "I noticed it within my first week here, though I did not understand why until tonight." "Then perhaps," Julian said, "you already have an advantage I have lacked. A new face, someone Edmund does not yet see as a threat, watching this house with fresh eyes. If you are willing, you might notice things I have grown too accustomed to see clearly." "I am willing," Eleanor said, without hesitation. They talked long into the night after that, Julian explaining what he had already discovered, the missing documents from the estate office, the steward who reported directly to Edmund on matters that should have remained private, the strange timing of certain expenses that never quite matched the household ledgers. Eleanor listened carefully, asking questions, offering observations from her own short time in the house, and slowly, piece by piece, the outline of a conspiracy began to take clearer shape between them. Julian described the steward, a man named Pratt, who managed much of the day-to-day correspondence for the estate, and who had come into his position only after Julian's father died, recommended strongly by Edmund himself at the time. It had seemed a reasonable arrangement then, a familiar face during a difficult transition. Now, 3 years later, Julian admitted he could not recall a single decision Pratt had made that had not somehow also served Edmund's interests. Small adjustments to shipping contracts, minor delays in correspondence that always seemed to benefit whichever party Edmund favored. "I have watched him for over a year," Julian said. "I have never caught him in an outright lie, only a pattern of coincidences, too consistent to be accidental. Every time I have moved to replace him, Edmund has intervened on his behalf, citing loyalty, citing the difficulty of finding good staff. I allowed it to continue because removing him without proof would only warn Edmund that I suspected something, and a warned enemy is far more dangerous than one who believes himself unseen." "Then we will need proof," Eleanor said, "something undeniable enough that even a warned enemy cannot easily explain it away." "That is precisely what I have been trying to gather," Julian said, slowly, carefully, so as not to raise suspicion. "It is slow work, and lonely work, and I confess I had begun to wonder whether I would uncover the truth before Edmund grew impatient enough to try again." "You are not alone in it any longer," Eleanor reminded him. He looked at her then with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something between gratitude and disbelief, as though he could not quite trust that the offer was real. "No," he said slowly, "I suppose I am not." By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers bound by necessity, performing a marriage for the benefit of onlookers who would never see behind the curtain. They had become allies, bound not by affection alone but by shared danger, and a growing trust neither of them had expected to find on what should have been an ordinary, loveless wedding night. Julian rose to leave as the household began to stir, pausing at the door to look back at her one final time. "Whatever happens from here," he said, "I am glad it was you standing on the other side of that carriage yesterday morning." Eleanor watched him go, and for the first time since her father had woken her before sunrise to tell her she would be married by noon, she found herself looking forward to whatever came next, rather than simply enduring it. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Julian settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find. Breakfasts that had once passed in careful silence now included quiet exchanges of information, observations Eleanor had gathered the day before, small details Julian had noticed in the household ledgers. To anyone watching, they appeared to be simply a young married couple growing comfortable with one another. Only the two of them knew the truth of what those conversations actually contained. Eleanor took to her new role with a determination that surprised even herself. She began spending more time in the parts of the house she had previously avoided: the servants' corridors, the estate office, the kitchens, learning names, asking small favors, allowing herself to be seen as simply curious rather than suspicious. Betsy, in particular, began to soften toward her, offering small pieces of household history she had withheld before, though always carefully, always with an eye toward the door. "Mr. Pratt keeps his own study locked when he is away," Betsy mentioned one afternoon, almost in passing, as she helped Eleanor arrange her hair. "Even from the other staff. Mrs. Whitmore says it has always been that way, but I do not remember it being locked before Mr. Pratt came to the position." Eleanor filed the detail away carefully, thanking Betsy without pressing further, aware that too much interest too quickly would only raise suspicion. She reported it to Julian that evening, in the privacy of the small stone folly in the garden, a place they had begun to use for exactly these conversations, far enough from the house that no one could easily overhear. "A locked study," Julian repeated, considering this. "Worth investigating, though carefully. If there is anything incriminating inside, Pratt will not have left it somewhere easily found." "Perhaps not easily found by someone who works for him," Eleanor said, "but perhaps easily found by someone he does not yet consider a threat." There was more, too, that Eleanor had begun to notice, simply by paying attention to the small rhythms of the household. The cook, an older woman named Hannah, mentioned once that the wine cellar inventory had come up short twice in recent months, bottles unaccounted for that no one in the house admitted to taking. A footman named Charlie let slip, while carrying wood for the fire, that Pratt often received visitors late in the evening, men who arrived on foot rather than by carriage, as though wishing to avoid the sound of wheels on gravel announcing their presence. None of it was proof on its own. All of it, taken together, painted a picture of a household with far more secrets moving beneath its surface than its careful, polished exterior suggested. Eleanor began keeping a small notebook of her own, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, recording every detail she gathered, no matter how small it seemed at the time. She had learned, from watching her father's business slowly unravel years before, that patterns revealed themselves only when enough small pieces were gathered together and viewed as a whole. A single missing bottle of wine meant nothing. A pattern of missing bottles, late visitors, and a locked study told a very different story. Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his face. "You are beginning to think like someone who has done this before." "I have spent my whole life watching people carefully," Eleanor said. "My father's business failed slowly, over years, long before it collapsed entirely. I learned to notice small signs of trouble, long before they became impossible to ignore. This is not so different." Their plan, when it finally took shape, was simple in design, though it required patience to execute. Eleanor would find a reason to be near Pratt's study during one of his regular absences, when he traveled into the nearby town to handle correspondence and banking matters on the estate's behalf. Julian would ensure the household staff were occupied elsewhere during that same window, giving Eleanor the freedom to search without being observed. The opportunity came nearly 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon when Pratt departed for town earlier than usual. Eleanor waited until she was certain the house had settled into its normal rhythm before making her way toward the estate office, a leather-bound household journal tucked under her arm as an excuse should anyone question her presence in that part of the house. The study door was locked, exactly as Betsy had described. Eleanor had come prepared, however, with a thin metal hairpin Betsy had unknowingly provided when helping arrange her hair that morning, and a memory of watching a locksmith work on a stuck cabinet in her father's old office years before. It took longer than she expected, her hands trembling slightly with the effort of staying calm, but eventually the lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, the study was neat, almost obsessively so, papers organized into careful stacks, a ledger open on the desk showing recent transactions. Eleanor moved quickly, aware of how little time she truly had, scanning documents for anything that might connect Pratt's decisions directly to Edmund's interests. Most of what she found appeared ordinary: correspondence about shipping schedules, receipts for household expenses, nothing that would raise an eyebrow on its own. Then, tucked beneath a stack of unremarkable letters, she found something different. A folded note, unsigned, written in a hand she did not recognize, instructing Pratt to delay the renewal of a particular shipping contract until further notice, and to ensure that any inquiries from the Duke regarding the delay were met with vague explanations about difficulties with the merchant involved. The note made no direct mention of Edmund, but the instructions matched precisely the kind of quiet interference Julian had described, small delays and obstacles that always seemed to serve someone else's purposes. Eleanor's hands shook as she read it a second time. committing the details to memory, before carefully returning it to its original place beneath the stack of letters, exactly as she had found it. She could not risk removing it outright, not yet, not without alerting Pratt that someone had discovered his hidden instructions. But she now had something concrete to bring to Julian, proof that the interference he had suspected for months was not merely coincidence, but deliberate, coordinated sabotage. She relocked the study door with the same hairpin, smoothed her skirts, and walked away with the household journal still tucked under her arm, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear of being caught, and everything to do with the thrill of having actually found something real. She found Julian in his own study an hour later and relayed everything she had seen, watching his expression shift from careful attention to something harder, more focused, as the pieces continued falling into place. "This is the proof we needed," he said, once she had finished. "Not enough on its own to bring before the family trust, perhaps, but enough to confirm we are looking in the right direction. If Pratt is receiving instructions like this regularly, there will be more. We simply need to find where he keeps them, and how they connect back to Edmund directly." "There is something else," Eleanor said. "The handwriting on the note. It was not Edmund's. Not that I recognized from the letters he has sent to the house before. Someone else may be involved, someone acting as a go-between." Julian's expression darkened further at this. "That would explain a great deal. Edmund is careful. Careful enough that I have never managed to catch him directly involved in anything incriminating. If he has been using an intermediary, someone willing to handle the details on his behalf, it would explain why I have found nothing conclusive after months of watching him myself. Who would he trust with something like this?" "That," Julian said, "is exactly what we now need to discover." They began, cautiously, to widen their attention beyond Pratt alone. Julian arranged to review the household accounts personally, something he admitted he had rarely done in recent years, having trusted the estate's day-to-day management to men his father had once employed. What he found troubled him further. Several payments to a merchant house in town, modest enough individually to escape notice, but consistent enough over time to suggest a standing arrangement rather than ordinary business. He recognized the merchant's name vaguely, a man who had once done work for Edmund's own household before Edmund's allowance had been reduced the previous year. "It could be nothing," Julian admitted, showing Eleanor the relevant pages one evening. "Estates often maintain relationships with the same merchants for years, out of habit rather than scheme. But the timing troubles me. These payments began shortly after Edmund's allowance was cut, as though he found another source of funds to draw from." "Funds drawn from your own estate, without your knowledge," Eleanor said slowly. "That would mean Pratt is not simply delaying contracts to inconvenience you. He may be actively diverting money as well." "If that is true," Julian said, his voice grim, "then this is no longer simply a matter of quiet sabotage. It is theft, conducted under my own roof, by a man I have trusted with my household's affairs for 3 years. Over the following days, they worked together more openly than before, comparing notes each evening, mapping out the pattern of delays and obstacles that had quietly hampered the estate's affairs for longer than either of them had previously realized. Eleanor found herself growing genuinely absorbed in the work, energized by the sense of purpose it gave her, a feeling entirely different from the passive loneliness she had braced herself for on her wedding day. Something else was shifting between them as well, something neither of them named directly but both seemed to notice. Their conversations in the Folly grew longer than strictly necessary for the business of uncovering a conspiracy. Julian began seeking her out during the day, not only to discuss what she had discovered but simply to ask how her afternoon had passed, a small courtesy that felt increasingly less like formality and more like genuine interest. Eleanor caught herself, more than once, looking forward to these moments with an eagerness she had not expected to feel toward a marriage built on necessity rather than affection. One evening, as they sat together in the Folly reviewing a stack of household receipts, Julian reached for a paper at the same moment Eleanor did, and their hands brushed briefly before both pulled back. Neither of them commented on it, but Eleanor noticed the way his attention lingered a fraction of a second longer than it needed to, and felt her own pulse quicken in response. "You have changed things here," Julian said quietly, breaking the small silence that followed. "More than I expected when I made this arrangement. I do not think I fully understood what it would mean to have someone genuinely on my side. You gave me a role to play," Eleanor said. "Something real, rather than simply enduring a marriage in silence. I did not expect to find purpose in it either, but I have." "Is that all it is?" he asked, his voice quieter still. "Purpose?" Eleanor met his gaze across the small table, aware of how close they had drifted without either of them quite meaning to. "I am not certain," she admitted honestly. but I find I do not mind not knowing yet." Julian did not press further, though something in his expression suggested he was equally unwilling to name what was growing between them too quickly. Instead, he returned his attention to the receipts spread across the table, and Eleanor did the same, though both of them worked more slowly than before, aware of the other's presence in a way that had nothing to do with conspiracies or hidden letters. Later that same night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat by her window and thought back over everything that had changed in the weeks since her wedding day. She had arrived at Ravensmoor expecting silence, expecting a marriage that would ask nothing of her beyond her presence and her name. Instead, she had found a household full of quiet danger, a husband carrying a burden far heavier than she had imagined, and, unexpectedly, a growing sense of belonging to something that mattered. She thought, too, of her father, and the shame he had carried the morning he woke her to explain the marriage he had arranged. He had believed he was condemning her to a lonely, hollow life, a punishment disguised as protection. She wondered if he could see her now, gathering evidence in a locked study, comparing handwriting and household ledgers with a man who had begun to trust her with his deepest fears, whether he would recognize the daughter he had sent away that morning at all. It was, perhaps, the most dangerous development of all, more dangerous even than the threat Edmund posed. A marriage built on convenience and secrecy was beginning to grow into something neither of them had planned for, something that would make the stakes of whatever came next far higher than either of them had originally bargained for. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed to both Julian and Eleanor in Edmund's careful, elegant hand. A gathering at his own townhouse in London, he wrote, a small celebration among family and close friends to mark the anniversary of his late father's charitable foundation. Nothing unusual in the request itself, except that Edmund had never before hosted such an event, and the timing, arriving so soon after Julian had begun quietly reviewing the household accounts, struck both of them as far from coincidental. "He knows we are looking into something," Julian said, turning the invitation over in his hands, as though it might reveal more than the words written on its surface. "Or he suspects it at least. This is not generosity, this is a test." "Or an opportunity," Eleanor said. "If he means to draw us out, perhaps we should let him believe he has succeeded, and use the gathering to observe him more closely than we could here at Ravensmoor." Julian studied her for a long moment, the way he often did now when she surprised him, which had become more frequent than either of them likely expected when this arrangement began. "You are certain you wish to walk directly into whatever he has planned?" "I would rather walk toward the danger with my eyes open than wait here, wondering what shape it will take," Eleanor said. "We have gathered enough now to know he is capable of theft and interference. I do not believe he will attempt anything so bold as violence in front of half of London society. This is more likely to be about reputation, about finding some way to weaken your position publicly rather than privately." She was, as it turned out, largely correct, though the shape the attack finally took surprised even her. The gathering itself began pleasantly enough, a crowded room full of familiar faces from the season, polite conversation over champagne, the charitable foundation mentioned only briefly before the true business of socializing took over. Eleanor stayed close to Julian's side throughout the evening, watching Edmund carefully as he moved through the room with practiced charm, greeting guests, accepting compliments about his generosity in hosting such an event. It was nearly an hour into the gathering when Edmund raised his glass and called for the attention of the room, ostensibly to offer a toast in his father's memory. Eleanor felt Julian tense beside her, sensing, as she did, that whatever Edmund had planned was about to unfold. "Before I speak of my father," Edmund began, his voice carrying easily across the quieted room, "I find myself compelled to address a matter that has troubled me greatly in recent weeks. It concerns family and duty and the difficult position I now find myself in as someone who cares deeply for the future of the Ravensmoor name." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Beside her, Julian's expression remained perfectly composed, though she could feel the tension radiating from him even without looking directly at his face. "There have been questions," Edmund continued, "about my cousin's fitness to continue managing the estate's affairs. Questions I have tried, out of loyalty, to ignore. But when a man begins accusing loyal servants of theft without evidence, when he grows increasingly withdrawn and suspicious of everyone around him, even his own family, I believe it becomes a matter that concerns us all." A murmur rippled through the gathered guests. Eleanor recognized the strategy immediately, painting Julian as unstable, paranoid, unfit to manage his own household, using the very investigation they had conducted so carefully as evidence of instability rather than diligence. "That is a serious accusation to make at a gathering meant to honor your father's memory," Julian said, his voice calm despite the challenge, cutting through the murmurs with practiced control. Perhaps you might explain precisely what evidence supports it, rather than relying on the impression of a room full of guests unfamiliar with the actual circumstances. Edmund's smile did not waver. I have spoken with members of your own household, cousin. Servants who have expressed concern about your recent behavior, about accusations leveled against a steward who has served your family faithfully for years. I have also spoken with members of the family trust, who share my concern that perhaps the pressures of the title have grown too heavy for you to bear alone. It was, Eleanor realized, a carefully constructed trap, built from half-truths designed to sound damning without any single claim being entirely false. Julian had, in fact, grown suspicious of Pratt. He had, in fact, become more withdrawn since the poisoning attempt years before. Edmund had taken every true fragment and arranged them into a story that painted paranoia rather than genuine danger. Before Julian could respond, Eleanor stepped forward, drawing the room's attention toward herself for the first time that evening. "Perhaps I might offer some clarity," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "Since I have spent these recent weeks at Ravensmoor far more closely than anyone else in this room, including, I suspect, Edmund himself." The room's attention shifted fully toward her now, curious whispers rising among the guests who had, until this moment, known her only as the unexpected bride society had gossiped about for weeks. "My husband has not accused a loyal servant of theft without cause," Eleanor continued. "He has uncovered evidence, careful and documented evidence, of interference in the estate's contracts and diversion of household funds. I have seen this evidence myself. I have, in fact, helped gather a portion of it personally. Evidence easily fabricated by a wife eager to defend her husband's reputation," Edmund said smoothly, though Eleanor noticed the faintest flicker of unease cross his face for the first time that evening. "Then perhaps you would care to explain," Eleanor said, reaching into the small reticule she had carried specifically for this purpose, "why a merchant house that once did business exclusively with your household began receiving regular payments from Ravensmoor's estate accounts, beginning precisely when your own allowance was reduced last year." She withdrew a folded paper, a careful copy of the account entries she and Julian had reviewed together, and held it up for the room to see without yet handing it over, aware that the gesture itself carried more weight in this moment than the document's actual contents. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Edmund's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the evening, finally cracked, just slightly, a tightness appearing around his eyes that had not been there moments before. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "A misunderstanding, easily explained, twisted into an accusation by a woman who married into this family only weeks ago and understands nothing of its history." "Then explain it," Julian said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside Eleanor, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. "Explain it here, in front of the family and friends you claim to be protecting, rather than whispering accusations behind my back to servants and trustees while avoiding any direct conversation with me." Edmund's eyes moved between Julian and Eleanor, calculating, searching for some path out of the trap that had, moments before, seemed to belong entirely to him. Eleanor watched his composure fracture further, watched him understand, in real time, that the evening he had planned to end in Julian's humiliation had instead turned into his own. "I have nothing further to say on the matter tonight," Edmund finally managed, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is neither the time nor the place for such accusations." "You raised the matter first, cousin," Julian said. "I am merely finishing the conversation you began." The room remained silent, guests exchanging glances, waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. It was Eleanor who finally broke the tension, turning toward the assembled guests with a composure she had not fully known she possessed until this precise moment. "My husband and I do not wish to disrupt an evening meant to honor a man's memory," she said. "We will address these matters properly, through the family trust and, if necessary, through legal channels, rather than continuing to discuss them here. I only wish to ensure that if accusations are made against my husband's character, the truth is heard alongside them, rather than allowed to stand unanswered." It was a graceful exit from a moment that could easily have descended into further chaos, and Eleanor felt the room's tension ease slightly, guests returning to quiet conversation, the immediate crisis of the evening deflected if not entirely resolved. Edmund excused himself shortly afterward, his earlier charm entirely abandoned, and Julian and Eleanor departed not long after, neither of them speaking until they were safely inside their own carriage. "You were extraordinary tonight," Julian said, once the carriage had pulled away from Edmund's townhouse. I did not expect him to move so publicly, nor did I expect you to counter him so effectively when he did. He believed a public accusation would leave you no room to respond without appearing defensive, Eleanor said. He did not account for someone standing beside you willing to answer in your place. He will not forgive this humiliation easily, Julian said, his expression growing serious again. If anything, tonight will push him toward more drastic action, now that he understands the evidence against him is stronger than he believed. Eleanor felt a chill at this, understanding immediately that the confrontation, however successfully navigated, had not ended the danger but rather escalated it. Edmund had shown his hand publicly, and cornered men, she suspected, were far more dangerous than confident ones. Then we must move quickly, she said, before he has time to plan whatever comes next. Julian took her hand in the darkness of the carriage, an unfamiliar gesture between them that felt, in this moment, entirely natural. We will face it together, he said, whatever it turns out to be. They returned to Ravensmoor late that night, and though exhaustion pressed at Eleanor from every direction, sleep did not come easily. She lay awake turning the evening over in her mind, replaying Edmund's expression the moment he realized his trap had failed, the flicker of genuine fear beneath his practiced anger. A man who had spent years building a careful reputation did not lose his composure so completely over a simple misunderstanding. Whatever the merchant payments truly represented, Edmund understood exactly how damaging their exposure could become. The following morning, Julian called for Mr. Whitfield, the family solicitor, a cautious man who had served the Hartley family for over 2 decades, and whose discretion Julian trusted more than almost anyone else connected to the estate. Eleanor sat beside her husband as he laid out everything they had gathered, the locked study, the intercepted note, the pattern of payments to Edmund's former merchant. Whitfield listened without interruption, his expression growing graver with each new detail. This is serious enough to bring before the family trust, Whitfield said finally, but I must caution you both. Edmund is well liked among the trustees. Many of them remember him as a charming young man who suffered greatly after his own father's early death. Evidence of this nature will need to be presented carefully and completely, or it risks being dismissed as exactly what he claimed last night, a wife's overzealous defense of her husband's reputation. Then we will gather more, Julian said. Enough that dismissal becomes impossible. There is also the matter of Pratt, Whitfield added. If he is indeed acting as an intermediary, he may hold documents or correspondence that connects Edmund directly to these arrangements, rather than the circumstantial pattern you currently possess. Finding a way to secure that correspondence, without alerting either man to your intentions, would strengthen your position considerably. Eleanor and Julian exchanged a glance, both already thinking of the locked study, the hairpin still tucked carefully in Eleanor's jewelry box, and the risk of a second search now that suspicion had almost certainly been raised. It will need to happen soon, Eleanor said, once Whitfield had departed. Before Edmund has time to warn Pratt, or before Pratt grows cautious enough to destroy whatever remains in that study. Agreed, Julian said, but we cannot move carelessly. Last night proved Edmund is watching us as closely as we are watching him. A second search discovered now would confirm every suspicion he already holds. They spent the following days in careful preparation, Eleanor once again drawing close to the household staff, listening for any sign that Pratt had grown wary, watching for changes in his routine that might suggest a warning had already reached him from London. To her relief and slight surprise, life at Ravensmoor continued much as it had before, Pratt maintaining his usual schedule, the household staff unaware of the confrontation that had taken place at Edmund's gathering. It was Betsy, in the end, who provided the opening they needed, mentioning almost in passing that Pratt intended to travel to a neighboring estate the following week, to settle a dispute over shared boundary land, a trip that would keep him away from Ravensmoor for at least 2 full days. Eleanor relayed the information to Julian that same evening, and together they began planning a second, more thorough search of the locked study, one that would need to uncover enough evidence to satisfy even a cautious solicitor, and a trust full of trustees, inclined to give Edmund the benefit of every doubt. Neither of them could have predicted, as they finalized their plans in the quiet privacy of the Folly, how quickly circumstances would force their hand, nor how much more dangerous the coming days would prove to be than either of them had yet imagined. 3 nights before Pratt's planned departure, Eleanor woke suddenly, certain she had heard something move in the corridor outside her room. She lay still for a long moment, listening, before rising quietly and crossing to the door. When she opened it, the hallway stood empty, lit only by the low glow of a single wall lamp left burning through the night. She might have dismissed the sound entirely, if not for the faint smell of smoke drifting from the direction of the estate office, sharp and unmistakable even at this distance. She woke Julian at once, and together they hurried downstairs to find a small fire smoldering in a wastepaper basket just outside Pratt's locked study, already being smothered by 2 footmen who had been roused by the smell moments before. The damage thankfully was minor, contained before it could spread beyond the basket itself. But when Julian examined the scorched remains left behind, he found the charred edges of paper that had clearly been burned deliberately, rather than caught by accident. Someone's hurried attempt to destroy documents before they could be discovered. "Someone already knew we intended to search that study," Julian said grimly, once the fire had been fully extinguished and the shaken footmen sent back to their rooms. "This was not carelessness. This was destruction, meant to remove whatever evidence remained before we could find it." Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her. Pratt did not leave for his journey until tomorrow. If he set this fire himself tonight, it means someone warned him we were close to discovering the truth. "Which means," Julian said quietly, "there is still someone in this house passing information to Edmund, someone close enough to know our plans almost as soon as we make them." The realization hung heavy between them in the darkened hallway, the small fire extinguished but the danger it represented burning brighter than ever. Whatever evidence had been destroyed that night, one truth remained painfully clear. Edmund was no longer simply watching from a distance. He was moving now, quickly and without hesitation, and the quiet, careful investigation Eleanor and Julian had conducted over the past weeks had officially become a race against time. Morning brought no answers, only a household on edge, and a study door standing open, its lock forced from the inside rather than picked from without. Whoever had set the fire had done so with a key, or with Pratt's own hand, and Julian's suspicion of an informant within his own walls had hardened overnight into certainty. He gathered the senior staff before breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore, the footman who had discovered the flames, and several others who held positions of trust within the household. He said little about what had actually been found in the study, only that a fire had occurred, and that he intended to discover exactly how it had started. Eleanor watched the faces in the room carefully as he spoke, searching for any flicker of guilt, any misplaced glance that might reveal who among them had betrayed his trust. It was Charlie, the young footman who had first noticed the smoke the night before, who finally stepped forward once the others had been dismissed, his expression troubled. "There is something I should have mentioned before, Your Grace," he said quietly, once only Julian and Eleanor remained in the room with him. "I did not think much of it at the time, but Mrs. Whitmore's nephew has been visiting more often these past months, always in the evenings, always let in through the servants' entrance rather than the front door." Eleanor felt a chill move through her. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper who had greeted her so formally on her very first night at Ravensmoor, the woman who ran the household with such quiet, controlled efficiency that Eleanor had never once suspected her of anything beyond strict professionalism. "Her nephew," Julian repeated slowly. "Do you know his name?" "Only that she calls him Daniel," Charlie said. "He works in town, I believe, though I could not say where exactly." Julian's expression turned grim. "Daniel is the name of the merchant Pratt has been quietly funneling payments toward. I confirmed it myself in the account records only last week." The pieces, scattered for so long across weeks of careful investigation, finally began arranging themselves into a complete picture. Mrs. Whitmore, trusted implicitly for years, had likely been passing information to her nephew, who in turn maintained the connection between Pratt's quiet sabotage and Edmund's distant, careful hand. It explained how Edmund had learned of their suspicions so quickly, how Pratt had been warned in time to burn whatever evidence remained in his study before it could be found. Confronting Mrs. Whitmore directly, Julian decided, carried too great a risk of her simply denying everything and warning Edmund that their true suspicions had finally surfaced. Instead, he and Eleanor devised a quieter approach, watching her movements carefully over the following 2 days, noting when she left the house, whom she met, what she carried with her when she returned. On the second evening, their patience was rewarded. Mrs. Whitmore left Ravensmoor just after dusk, walking rather than taking a carriage, toward the small village a short distance from the estate. Eleanor, dressed plainly and wrapped in a dark cloak that would draw no attention, followed at a careful distance, while Julian took a different route to approach the village from the opposite direction, ensuring they would not lose sight of her regardless of which way she turned. Mrs. Whitmore entered a small inn near the edge of the village, and through a gap in the curtains of a private room on the ground floor, Eleanor could see her seated across from a younger man, who bore enough resemblance to be believably her nephew. Julian arrived moments later, and together they watched as Mrs. Whitmore withdrew a small bundle of papers from beneath her cloak and passed them across the table. It was, Eleanor realized with a rush of vindication mixed with dread, exactly the confirmation they needed, and precisely the danger they had feared. Whatever remained of Pratt's incriminating documents, saved somehow from the fire, was being carried directly out of the house at this very moment, likely on its way to Edmund himself. Julian did not hesitate. He entered the inn directly, Eleanor close behind him, and the sudden appearance of the Duke of Ravensmoor in a quiet village inn brought the low conversation in the room to an immediate, startled silence. Mrs. Whitmore's face drained of color the moment she saw them, the bundle of papers still resting on the table between her and her nephew. "Your Grace," she managed, rising quickly from her chair, though there was nowhere for her to go, and both she and Julian seemed to understand this immediately. "I would like those papers," Julian said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Whitmore's shoulders sagged, years of careful composure finally breaking under the weight of discovery, and she sat back down heavily, defeat settling over her features. "I did not want this," she said quietly. "You must believe that, Your Grace. My nephew found himself in debt, serious debt, to men who would have seen him ruined or worse. Edmund offered to settle those debts, in exchange for small favors, small pieces of information passed along about the household. I told myself it was harmless at first. I did not know, not truly, what it would grow into." "You knew enough to warn Pratt to burn evidence 3 nights ago," Julian said, his voice hard now. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simple fear of consequences, Eleanor could not be entirely certain. "Edmund sent word after your gathering in London. He said the investigation had grown dangerous, that anything incriminating in Pratt's study needed to disappear before it could be found. I did not know what it truly contained. I swear that to you." Eleanor reached for the bundle of papers still resting on the table, and Mrs. Whitmore made no move to stop her. Inside, along with several letters bearing Edmund's unmistakable handwriting, unguarded enough to make no pretense of the arrangement they described, was a detailed record of payments made to Pratt in exchange for specific interferences in the estate's affairs, delayed contracts, redirected funds, all traced directly back to instructions from Edmund himself. It was, finally, undeniable proof, gathered not through careful deduction alone, but through Edmund's own panicked attempt to destroy the evidence that ultimately delivered it directly into their hands. In the days leading up to the formal meeting, Julian and Eleanor worked closely with Whitfield to organize everything they had gathered into a case too complete to dismiss. Eleanor found herself drafting a careful, detailed account of her own discoveries, the locked study, the intercepted note, the pattern of payments, the confrontation at the inn, writing and rewriting until every detail sat in clear, undeniable order. Whitfield reviewed her account twice, correcting small points of phrasing that might otherwise leave room for doubt, and told her, with something close to genuine admiration, that few solicitors he had trained could have assembled testimony so precisely. "You have a mind suited for this kind of work," he told her, one afternoon as they reviewed the final documents together. "It is a shame such talents so rarely find proper use among women of your standing." "Perhaps that will change," Eleanor said, though she said it lightly, unwilling to dwell too long on ambitions that felt, for now, secondary to the immediate danger still facing her husband. The confrontation with the family trust took place a week later, in a formal meeting Whitfield had carefully arranged, presenting the gathered evidence alongside Julian's own testimony and Eleanor's account of everything she had witnessed and uncovered. Edmund arrived expecting, Eleanor suspected, another opportunity to twist the narrative in his favor, only to find himself facing letters written in his own hand, evidence he could not explain away with charm or careful half-truths. The trustees, who had once been inclined to give Edmund every benefit of the doubt, listened in grim silence as the full scope of his scheme was laid before them. Theft from the estate, deliberate interference in Julian's affairs, and, most damning of all, evidence strongly suggesting his involvement in the poisoning attempt 3 years earlier, confirmed when one of the trustees recalled details of that fateful dinner that aligned precisely with the timeline Edmund had always claimed to have no knowledge of. Edmund's protests grew increasingly desperate as the meeting continued, his careful charm entirely abandoned in favor of open anger, accusations flung wildly at Julian, at Eleanor, at anyone who might have listened weeks earlier and spared him this reckoning. But the evidence spoke for itself, undeniable and thoroughly documented, and by the meeting's end, the trustees had unanimously agreed to strip Edmund of his position as presumptive heir and to pursue formal legal action regarding the theft and financial interference, with further investigation to follow regarding the poisoning 3 years before. Edmund was escorted from the room, still protesting, still insisting he had been wronged, though no one present any longer believed him. Mrs. Whitmore, given the genuine desperation of her circumstances and her eventual cooperation, was allowed to leave Julian's service quietly, rather than face formal charges, on the condition that neither she nor her nephew ever set foot near Ravensmoor again. In the weeks that followed, formal legal proceedings moved forward regarding the financial theft, and a separate, quieter investigation began into the events of that dinner in Florence 3 years earlier, led by an investigator Whitfield trusted implicitly. Eleanor did not envy Edmund the coming months, though she found she could summon little sympathy for a man who had been willing to poison his own family and destroy his cousin's life for the sake of a title. Pratt, once confronted with the full weight of evidence against him, offered a complete confession in exchange for leniency, providing further detail that strengthened the case against Edmund considerably, and confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, the true extent of the conspiracy that had shadowed Ravensmoor for years. Julian threw himself into restoring order to the estate's affairs once the immediate danger had passed, reviewing every contract Pratt had touched, correcting the quiet damage done over months of interference, and slowly rebuilding trust with a household staff who had spent years learning to fear speaking too freely within their own home. Eleanor watched him work with a new kind of energy, less guarded than before, willing now to ask for help rather than carrying every burden alone, and she found herself proud, in a way she had not expected to feel toward a husband she had married as a stranger only weeks before. That evening, Julian and Eleanor stood together on the same terrace where they had first spoken honestly weeks before. The danger that had shadowed their entire marriage finally, truly lifted. The estate felt different somehow, lighter, as though the whole household had been holding its breath for years and had only now remembered how to exhale. "It is over," Eleanor said quietly, still somewhat disbelieving of the words even as she spoke them. "Because of you," Julian said, turning to face her fully. "I spent 3 years chasing shadows alone, certain I could trust no one enough to share this burden. You changed that. From the very first night I told you the truth. You gave me the chance to matter," Eleanor said. "I did not expect that, not from a marriage that began the way ours did." Julian reached for her hand, the same gesture that had felt so unfamiliar in the carriage weeks before, now settling naturally between them. "This marriage began as a transaction," he said. "A convenient arrangement between two people with no other choice. I do not wish it to remain that way any longer, Eleanor. Whatever London believed about us, whatever we ourselves believed on our wedding day, I find that I have come to care for you a great deal, more than I ever expected to allow myself to feel again." Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest, an emotion she had not permitted herself to name until this exact moment, standing on this same terrace where honesty had first taken root between them. "I feel the same," she said softly. "I did not expect to find this, not here, not with you. But I am glad, more than I can properly express, that I did." Julian's hand rose to gently cup her face, and for the first time since their hurried, cold wedding ceremony, he kissed her, not out of obligation or performance for watching eyes, but because he genuinely wished to, and because Eleanor, standing there in the cool evening air with the danger finally lifted from their shared lives, wished for exactly the same thing. The wedding night that society had assumed would never truly happen, the marriage everyone believed existed only as a hollow arrangement between a reluctant duke and a desperate merchant's daughter, had transformed instead into something neither of them could have predicted on that cold morning weeks before. Not the loveless arrangement London had mocked, nor the dangerous secret Julian had guarded alone for 3 long years, but a genuine partnership, forged through danger and honesty, standing now on solid ground neither of them intended to abandon. Word of Edmund's disgrace spread through London within days, and the same drawing rooms that had once whispered cruel jokes about a duke forced into an unwanted marriage now spoke instead of a duchess who had uncovered a conspiracy and helped save her husband's life and legacy. Invitations that had once excluded Eleanor entirely began arriving at Ravensmoor in growing numbers, hostesses eager now to claim acquaintance with the woman who had outwitted a scheming heir in front of half the ton. Eleanor accepted a few, mostly out of curiosity, and found a strange satisfaction in standing in the very drawing rooms that had once dismissed her as an unfortunate footnote to a cruel joke of a marriage. Her father, when news finally reached him, arrived at Ravensmoor unannounced, hat in hand, uncertain of his welcome after the guilt he still carried over the marriage he had arranged in desperation. Eleanor received him in the same entrance hall that had once echoed so coldly beneath her footsteps on her first night in this house, and found, to her own surprise, that she held no anger toward him any longer, only a quiet understanding of a man who had done the only thing he knew how to do to save his family, without ever imagining it might lead here. "I did not know," George Ashby said quietly, what kind of man I was sending you to. Neither did I, Eleanor admitted, but I am glad, in the end, that you did. Eleanor found she cared very little for the shift in public opinion either way. What mattered, standing beside Julian as the household finally settled into peace, was not what society believed about their marriage, but what she and Julian now knew to be true about each other, forged through weeks that had asked everything of them and given, in return, something neither of them had dared to hope for. A year had passed since the night Mrs. Whitmore's confession finally unraveled the conspiracy that had shadowed Ravensmoor for so long, and the estate Eleanor now walked through each morning bore little resemblance to the cold, watchful house she had first entered as a frightened bride with no expectations of warmth. The portraits still lined the long gallery, stern Hartley ancestors staring down as they always had, but the silence beneath them no longer felt like judgment. It felt, instead, like the quiet of a home finally at peace. Julian had spent much of the past year rebuilding what Edmund's years of quiet sabotage had damaged, restoring contracts that had been deliberately delayed, repairing relationships with tenants and merchants who had grown wary during the years of mismanagement under Pratt's careful interference. It was slow, steady work, and Eleanor had watched her husband approach it with a patience and openness that stood in sharp contrast to the guarded, isolated man she had married. He asked for help now, from his stewards, from the tenants themselves, and most of all from her, consulting Eleanor on decisions large and small in a way that would have seemed impossible during those first cold weeks of their marriage. Edmund's trial had concluded some months earlier, the evidence gathered by Eleanor and Julian proving more than sufficient to secure a conviction for the theft and financial fraud, and further investigation into the poisoning 3 years prior had produced enough corroborating testimony from witnesses present at that fateful dinner in Florence to see him formally charged for that crime as well. He would spend a great many years paying for the ambition that had once nearly cost Julian his life, stripped entirely of the title he had spent so long scheming to inherit. Eleanor did not think of him often anymore. There was too much else now, filling the space his shadow had once occupied. Pratt had left the district entirely after his confession, his reputation ruined beyond any hope of recovery, and a new steward, a steady, honest man named Harold Bennett, recommended by Whitfield himself, had taken over the estate's affairs with a transparency that made Eleanor's careful watchfulness, once so necessary, feel almost unnecessary now. She still kept her small notebook, tucked beneath the same loose floorboard where it had always lived, though these days its pages held little more than household accounts and garden plans rather than evidence of conspiracy. Mrs. Whitmore's position had been filled by a younger woman named Constance, warm where her predecessor had been guarded, and the entire household seemed to breathe more easily under her management, servants speaking freely in the halls in a way Eleanor had never once witnessed during her first months at Ravensmoor. Betsy remained Eleanor's lady's maid, closer now to a genuine friend than a servant bound by careful discretion, and the two women often spent quiet mornings together, Betsy no longer needing to guard every word she offered about the household's history. Charlie, the young footman whose small observation about Mrs. Whitmore's nephew had ultimately unraveled the entire conspiracy, had been promoted at Julian's insistence to a position of greater responsibility within the household, a reward for the quiet courage it had taken to speak up when silence would have been far easier. He had a habit now of greeting Eleanor with a small, knowing smile whenever their paths crossed, as though the two of them shared a private understanding of exactly how much that single conversation had changed the course of the household's future. Even Hannah, the cook whose offhand comment about missing wine bottles had first hinted at deeper trouble within the house, had grown more talkative since those anxious months, often sharing small stories from her years at Ravensmoor with a warmth that suggested she too felt the shift in the household's atmosphere. Eleanor found herself grateful for each of these small transformations, evidence that the fear which had once gripped every corner of the estate had genuinely lifted, rather than simply retreating out of sight. On a warm afternoon in early summer, Eleanor found Julian in the garden, near the same stone folly where they had once spent so many careful evenings comparing notes and building the case that would eventually save them both. He was not reviewing documents this time, only sitting quietly among the roses, and he smiled when he saw her approaching, the same smile that had first surprised her on that dark terrace so many months before, no longer rare or reluctant but familiar now, offered easily and often. "You look thoughtful," Eleanor said, settling beside him on the stone bench. "I was remembering," Julian said, "how frightened I was of this place, of this marriage, in those first weeks. I built an entire life around distance and suspicion, certain that closeness with anyone would only give Edmund another weapon to use against me. I never imagined that the woman I married for convenience would become the reason I finally felt safe enough to stop looking over my shoulder. You gave me more than safety in return, Eleanor said. A life with purpose. A marriage built on something real, rather than the hollow arrangement I braced myself for on our wedding day. He reached for her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing, nothing like the distant formal grip he had offered at the altar a year before. There is something I have been meaning to ask you, he said, though I confess I have been searching for the right moment for longer than I should admit. Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the seriousness in his voice, though nothing in his expression suggested worry, only a kind of careful tenderness she had come to know well over the past months. I know our marriage began as an arrangement neither of us chose freely, Julian continued. A transaction dressed up in a wedding gown, meant to satisfy my family's trustees and save your family from ruin. I have never regretted how it began, because it led me here, to this exact moment. But I find I want more than the marriage circumstance handed us. I want the marriage we have built since, freely and completely, acknowledged not as convenience but as choice. He withdrew a small velvet box from his coat, opening it to reveal a ring, far simpler than Eleanor might have expected from a duke, delicate and clearly chosen with care rather than ostentation. Eleanor Hartley, he said, I know we are already married in the eyes of the law and the church, but I would like to ask you properly, as I should have from the very beginning, if you would choose this marriage, and choose me, not out of necessity, but because you want to. Eleanor felt tears gather that she did not try to hide, overwhelmed by a tenderness she had never expected to find in a marriage that had begun with such cold, hurried vows in a chapel outside London. I choose you, she said softly. I have chosen you for months now, in every quiet evening in this garden, in every moment we faced danger together rather than apart. This is simply the first time you have asked me to say it aloud. Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, and the kiss that followed carried none of the caution or uncertainty of their earliest days together, only the quiet certainty of two people who had built something real out of circumstances designed to keep them apart. News of their happiness spread through London society over the following weeks, and the same drawing rooms that had once mocked the marriage of a supposedly indifferent duke to a penniless merchant's daughter now spoke of them as one of the season's great romances, a story people repeated with genuine warmth rather than cruel amusement. Eleanor found she still cared little for society's opinion either way, though she could not deny a certain satisfaction in watching the narrative shift so completely from the humiliation she had braced herself for on her wedding day. Her father visited often now, no longer burdened by the guilt that had weighed on him during that first difficult visit, watching his daughter build a life he had never imagined possible when he woke her before sunrise to explain the marriage he had arranged in desperation. He had found modest, honest work managing accounts for a smaller merchant house in the city, rebuilding slowly what his earlier mistakes had cost the family, and Eleanor found she respected the quiet effort more than she ever could have respected easy wealth handed to him instead. As autumn approached, Eleanor and Julian began discussing plans for the estate's future in earnest, improvements to tenant housing that Edmund's years of quiet interference had long delayed, a school for the village children that Eleanor had wanted to establish since her earliest weeks at Ravensmoor, when she first understood how much good a household with real resources and real intention could accomplish. Julian listened to every proposal with genuine interest, and more often than not, found himself convinced by his wife's careful reasoning, a partnership built on mutual respect, rather than the distant courtesy that had defined their earliest days together. They broke ground on the school before the first frost arrived, a modest stone building at the edge of the village, and Eleanor took a personal hand in selecting its first teacher, a patient young woman named Grace who had once tutored merchant families in the city and welcomed the chance to teach children who might otherwise never learn their letters at all. Watching the building rise, plank by plank and stone by stone, gave Eleanor a satisfaction unlike anything she had felt before, a mark left on the world entirely her own, separate from the conspiracy and danger that had defined her first months as a duchess. Julian, for his part, found himself increasingly drawn into conversations with tenant farmers he had once left entirely to his stewards, walking the fields himself to understand firsthand what improvements might actually serve them best, rather than relying solely on reports filtered through other hands. Eleanor often accompanied him on these visits, and the tenants, wary at first of a duke who had spent years remaining distant from his own land, gradually warmed to a couple who seemed genuinely interested in more than the estate's ledgers. Standing once more on the terrace where honesty had first taken root between them, watching the sun set over gardens that no longer felt cold or unfamiliar, Eleanor thought back to the frightened young woman who had arrived at Ravensmoor expecting a lifetime of loneliness disguised as safety. That woman could never have imagined the life waiting for her beyond that first difficult night. A marriage transformed by danger and honesty into something genuine. A husband who had learned to trust again. And a home finally free of the shadows that had haunted it for so long. What began as a marriage forced upon two strangers by circumstance and desperation had become, in the end, exactly the kind of story society loved to tell and rarely witnessed in truth. Not a duke who could never love, and not a bride resigned to a hollow life, but two people who found, in the unlikeliest of beginnings, everything they had never known they were searching for.